kinds of societies they created in their wake.
So does studying religion in this way raise any eyebrows?
Yes, this can be quite controversial in the humanities, although more and more people are getting on board. So historians and religious studies scholars usually study one tradition at a time. You'll have a very specific niche that you'll spend your whole career studying and really reach a deep understanding of that. But for this kind of project, you need to look at all sorts of religions all over the world, and you need to find the traits that they share or don't, which is not something that the humanities has been a really big fan of doing, but it's gaining ground.
Interesting. Now, I've read that there are competing hypotheses to explain how moralizing religions came to be.
Yeah, there are a few. So really, the scientific study of religion as a whole, rather than one tradition or another, took off in the 90s and early 2000s with this thing called the cognitive science of religion. And the big theory out of that was that belief in supernatural agents and therefore deities were a byproduct of other cognitive abilities that we have. So our brains are just really good at picking out intentionality and actions behind processes, or these make us just kind of inclined to believe in the supernatural. And so the Big Gods team thinks that this byproduct hypothesis isn't sufficient to explain the overwhelming success of moralizing gods around the world. But some people do think it is. And some people think that you can explain all sorts of religions just as byproducts of different kinds of psychological circumstances in different kinds of societies. So there's another theory that says moralizing gods didn't give anyone a cooperative advantage, but rather once societies were successful enough that at least a certain class of people stopped having to worry about getting enough food to eat every day, they could start worrying about saving resources for later. They could start worrying about the afterlife, saving things for after death, which really doesn't make sense if you're starving, if you're risking starvation by doing that. Once you got rich enough, basically, your psychological priorities shift. And they think that once whole societies got rich enough, the psychological priorities could shift away from just getting what I need today to thinking about self-sacrifice, asceticism, saving for the afterlife, things like that, and that could have been the way that moralizing gods arose in different societies around the world.
Now, when I was reading about this, I immediately thought of ancient Greek and Roman societies with their highly organized and politically complex societies. It seems to me that their gods were more interested in their own petty squabbles than watching over the moral shortcomings of humans.
Yeah, I think there are two ways that the Big Gods team would look at Greeks and Romans. Also, I think ancient Egypt is a good way to think about these kind of older gods. So you could say, on the one hand, how big were the societies in Greece, for example? How big is the city-state compared to the Islamic Empire? And like, what kinds of purposes do you need gods to serve in different size societies? Does this scale up? Another way is to think about what it really means to be moral and pro-social. And so in the case of ancient Egypt, for example, you have a lot of religious strictures against interfering with the Nile, which doesn't strike us today as being particularly moral, but in the context of ancient Egypt, when everyone relied on cooperative agricultural practices and taking more water than you were allotted or stopping the flow for your neighbors could really, really screw things up for the rest of the society. Whether or not that is considered a moral concern is something that the scholars are debating right now. Beyond our conception of morality, what did other types of societies consider pro-social and moral? What kinds of social norms would they have needed help enforcing to make their societies work? It's different around the world.
How did societies with moralizing religions spread and become so successful, as we know from Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and even Mormonism today?
Once a belief in a moralizing God emerged, people became more cooperative, the society became bigger and bigger. Other people wanted to join that society. And this is sort of where rituals and what are called costly displays of faith come in. So this could be anything from a big financial donation to your church to circumcision or
shorthands for trustworthiness. So when people want to join the religion, they also go through these processes to prove that they're all in, basically, and that they can be trusted to cooperate and uphold the same social norms that the rest of the religious society does. And as this happens, the society just does better and better because of more and more cooperative whether they're able to grow a lot more food than everyone else because their irrigation systems are just so much more effective, or whether that's because, in the case of Islam, that they're able to create these worldwide networks of trade based on things like swearing on the Quran and mutual trust between Muslims all over the world. These economic and social benefits that a big cooperative society brings along with it. And as more and more people want to do that, that just helps these religions get bigger and bigger. Thanks for speaking with me, Lizzie. Thank you. Lizzie Wade writes about the big gods hypothesis. This Week in Science. And that concludes this edition of the Science Podcast. If you have any comments or suggestions for the show, write us at sciencepodcast@aaas.org or tweet to us at Science Magazine. You can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and many other places, or listen to us on the Science site. The show is a production of Science Magazine. Jeffrey Cook composed the music. I'm Sarah Crespi. On behalf of Science Magazine and its publisher, AAAS, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Science Podcast for September 4th, 2015. I'm Sarah Crespi. In this week's show, Suzanne Bard interviews newswriter Rich Stone on the state of science in Iran. And David Grimm is here with stories on the many benefits of a good night's sleep, plastic and
Benefits of a good night's sleep. This is something that really speaks to me very strongly right now. I love sleep and always seem to miss out on it these days. Now I have a new cause to crave it, staving off the common cold. Dave, I thought this was common knowledge.
It kind of is, and actually from my own anecdotal experience, I find that when I get less sleep, when I'm sleep deprived, I tend to get sick more often. I think a lot of people have that experience, but it has been just that. It's been pretty much anecdotal until now, and what's really cool about this new study is that researchers actually tested this idea experimentally.
They really pulled out all the stops to test this, in my opinion. I mean, they rented hotel rooms. Can you walk us through the whole thing?
They went to the hotel floor, I think.
Right.
Yeah, it was crazy. I mean, so they got about 164 volunteers, and the first thing they did was figure out how many hours a night these people normally sleep. And then what they did was they sequestered them in a hotel for 5 days so that they wouldn't get exposure to the outside world and the viruses. And then with a lot of them, they dripped cold virus into their nose. It's called the rhinovirus, which is responsible for the common cold, into their nose, and they tried to figure out who got sick by correlating that with who was getting the most amount of sleep and who was getting the least amount of sleep.
And the proof that these subjects actually got a cold was also very stringent. Did you notice that?
They weighed the snot. They actually had these people blow their nose into tissues, as people with colds are wont to do, and the researchers weighed the tissues to see how much snot was coming out. They also did some other tests, a little bit more perhaps rigorous. They took blood samples to see whether these people had antibodies to the virus in their body, a sign that they were trying to fight an infection. Also looked for the amount